Welcome to Firsts in Fiction, your first stop for learning to write fantastic fiction. I'm your host, Aaron Gansky, author of The Bargain, The Hand of Adonai series, and Firsts in Fiction.
And I'm Malden Gansky, up here in my secret hideaway in the central part of California, where the temperatures have plummeted to the 90s. So we're feeling a little bit better there. And Aaron, I see we have a guest.
We do. With us tonight, we have author Stephanie Carroll, the author of A White Room. She has a very distinguished bio coming from the journalism field before she started writing novels, and then pursued writing fiction and novels specifically, and inspired by such authors as Charlotte Perkins Gilman, and a really quality book. Stephanie is somebody I met at the California Writers Club, my local branch here. She came as a guest speaker, I guess it was in August, and yeah, and what I liked about Stephanie is in her talk, she mentioned the word synesthesia, and she's the first person I've met, aside from the college professor who taught me what synesthesia was. She was the first person who not only knew what it was, but was able to give examples of it. So I was suitably impressed, and I thought this is someone I need on the podcast. So we spoke afterward, and you got some quality writing chops, very gifted writer, and I'm just really thrilled to have you on the show. Is there something else you want to mention about yourself?
No, just wanted to say thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here today.
Absolutely.
Well, your husband's in the Navy, right?
He was. He retired.
Oh, well, I grew up in a Navy family, so I have to ask it. What was his rank when he retired?
He was a chief.
Chief?
Mm-hmm.
Yep. I was not. I never made it to chief. I didn't even make it to what is it, private? I don't know how the Navy works. I know, Pops, I'm a disappointment, but
oh no. I wasn't in the Navy either, but my stepfather was, my brother was. My stepfather retired as a chief petty officer after 20 years of working on airplanes and stuff. So anyway, as I was written some military fiction, I always like to keep track of those things. But enough about that.
Enough about that. Well, Pops, why don't you go ahead and give us the publishing term for the week?
All right, this one's going to sound a little odd. Stephanie will probably recognize this, but it's two letters, TK. Obviously not a word. TK, and came out of the journalism profession primarily, but other writers use it also. And TK stands for to come. Now, don't send me any emails telling me the word come is not spelled with a K. That's done intentionally. And the reason is it's a very odd letter combination, so it's easy to see in a manuscript. So when copy editors would go through, they would see where the writer perhaps had forgot to put in some information. And a writer will do that. They'll use TK when they don't want to stop what they're doing. They want to return to that spot, put in the information. They need to make a phone call, for example, in, say, journalism, or they have to review some notes from an interview, that kind of thing. And instead of breaking the sequence of writing, that stream of writing, they just put TK. And in fiction, the novelists will do that too, rather than break the stream of writing. They know that maybe they don't remember their character's hair color, and he ran his hand through his TK hair, and then you can come back to it later. And with modern computers now, it's very easy to do a search and replace. So it can take you right to the TK, and you can fill that in. But you will occasionally see that TK, which stands for to come. Lousy spelling. Nice little tool.
So, Stephanie, you ever use TK in your writing?
Believe it or not, that's actually the first time I've ever heard of that, and I'm thinking, wow, I wish I've known about that for all these years. I would have used it so many times. I've always used, comment feature, or I actually right now, when I leave off in my manuscript, I type in caps, left off, really large, because I can just search and find that. So same principle, but that's a really good tool. I'm glad to know about it.
Yeah, the computer has changed it some because we have that comment feature and track changes and the like. So some people just use comments like notes to self, and then they'll go to that and remember to do it. But one of the things it does is it helps copy editors see where you forgot to go back. So it still has value, and it's sometimes faster than writing a comment in the margin using track changes, though that's pretty much what I do when I'm either writing or editing.
Yeah,
so there you go.
I'll still use it from time to time, especially like you say, you don't want to go, switch your toolbar to review so you can hit new comment and all that kind of stuff, and then type in your comment. It's just, for me, it's a lot easier to kind of keep, like you say, the flow of momentum going through, and just the capital T, the capital K, and kind of move on. So easy to search for. So I've used that, but that's something that I learned from you quite some time ago. I don't know exactly how long ago, Pops, but I remember you telling me about it, and I started using it after that. So.
Well, I am old, so.
You are old as the hills, distinguished, well traveled.
Extinguished? Did you just call me extinguished?
I did. I did. So when I was talking with Stephanie, I said, I'd love to have you on the podcast. I said, why don't you shoot me some ideas of topics that you'd like to discuss? And you mentioned historical fiction was one, and I immediately shied away from that because I'm terrified of it. But you do a lot of historical fiction, a lot of research, and you had some other great topics. But the one that really popped out at me is magical realism, and I'm super in love with magical realism. I don't read a ton of it because it's still kind of hard to find, but I find elements of magical realism in some of my favorite stories. So I thought, yeah, let's talk about this, and I'm going to go ahead and admit a lot of ignorance on my behalf. And Pops, I'm just going to go ahead and own it for you. You don't know a ton about magical realism. Is that, you were saying that before the show? Not a huge magical realism kind of guy.
Let me see if I have this right. First, I'm extinguished, and now I'm ignorant. Okay, that's true. I know very little. I used to do reviews for a publisher, and by a review, I mean they would hire me to read a manuscript and to tell them if it had any potential. Should they be publishing it? Should they go the next step with the pub board and that sort of thing? And so I read a bunch of books, and somebody had written a magical realism book, or sometimes called magic realism. Well, some make distinctions between the two, and it really took me a while to digest what the person was doing because I wasn't used to it. Not that it was bad, it just I didn't realize what I was getting into when I started. Had I known that, I probably would have enjoyed it more in the beginning.
And it's interesting because it will throw people. It can be, if you don't know what you're getting yourself into, it can become very confusing at times. The stories that I give to my students that have magical realism elements tend to really confuse them. They were just having a discussion about it today, which I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit later. But before we get too far into it, I think it's best for our listeners to really know what we're talking about. If we're talking about magical realism, how is it different than speculative fiction, fantasy fiction, those types of things? So, Stephanie, you're the expert. How would you define magical realism?
Well, magical realism is a type of fiction that comes out of Latin America. It's been around for a long time, much longer than it had been actually titled, but it was first given a name. I have my little notes here that tell me in the 1940s by Cuban novelist, and I might say this wrong, Alejo Carpentier, who recognized it as a characteristic in much Latin American literature. And the most notable Latin American author who uses this technique is the Colombian author Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who wrote 100 Years of Solitude and Love in the Time of Cholera, and he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1982. And that kind of tells you where it comes from. But what exactly it is something that's a little hard to define. Some people would mistake it as being fantasy. Some people might mistake it as being supernatural. But it's a little bit different because what it mainly does is it blends those aspects, magic, supernatural, various things of that sort that you would find in a fantasy novel or even a horror story or science fiction. It blends those things into reality. And if it does it well, if the author does a good job, they can blend it so well that there's almost no question in the reader's minds as to whether or not it is real. They just accept it. There's some people who say, they'll come away from a book and they will actually forget for a minute that whatever they were reading about wasn't a part of our reality. That's how that's how good of a job some authors do with this. And it's not just I know what you guys are talking about when you say that, you know, if somebody started reading this, they would get a little bit thrown. That's a specific type of magical realism, but then there's another type of magical realism that we're a little bit more familiar with because people don't recognize it as being what it is. They just kind of see it as maybe fantasy. And that's something that you would see in films like Groundhog's Day or the movie Big, where a very spectacular thing happens, but it doesn't mean that we are thrown into a fantasy world or a science fiction world or even a world of major supernatural change. It's just this one magical thing that happens for inexplicable reasons. There's usually not a lot of explanation as to why this happens. That's the briefest definition I can possibly give you, but I think people will understand it a little bit better as we continue.
So is it safe to say that magical realism might have some magical elements, some fantasy-like elements, but it's still set in the real world? The rules, physics of our natural world around us, our modern societies are all still intact, but then there's one or two things that are just different that we know are impossible, but for the sake of story we kind of go along with it. Would that be like a good distinction between the fantasy setting, whereas magical realism takes place in the real world?
That's a pretty good explanation. I know that it can be confusing because magical realism is something that kind of comes under the same umbrella as speculative fiction. In fact, Amazon includes it as like a subgenre of fantasy, so a lot of people think it's just fantasy, but it's something that is definitely very well centered and based in our real world. So, you know, for example, in Twilight, that's set in our real world, but that's not magical realism. And part of the reason for that is that when we discover there is a vampire, the character and the audience is thrown into this alternate world where there are vampires and there's these vampire wars and this is all going on. It's just people don't know about it. Magical realism would be different because the discovery of a vampire would just be accepted and it wouldn't really be something that changed the character's reality that much. And an example of that is in Immortality. That's a film with Jude Law, and it's a magical realism vampire story. It's a much different take. If you have the time, I believe it's available on Netflix Instant. If you have the time to watch Immortality, you'll get a very different view of vampire fiction.
Excellent. Yeah. So that's kind of intriguing. I'm recalling currently a story that I heard on a podcast, which I believe was Radio Lab, and this might be kind of a good illustration, but as I remember, and I can't remember who wrote the story, and I will apologize forever, but as I remember the story, there was a group of people that are out on a boat and they're watching the moon set, and when it gets close to the earth, one of the people on the boat takes out a ladder and puts it up against the moon and climbs up the ladder to the moon and stays on the moon, and nobody else can get up there in time, and so they have to wait until the moon comes back the next night, and they try and talk him down from the moon, but he's, you know, unwilling to come down. So we've got this thing where normal physics works, except that the moon you can actually just walk to on a ladder. So it takes kind of that one element of our real world and kind of turns it upside down on its head, but everything else still operates the same way. Would you classify that as magical realism?
Yes, I would. I just did a quick Google search. Is it called Papa, Please Get the Moon for Me?
Oh my goodness. I'm going to say no.
I had to try because it's so curious. This is such a strange thing. I'm like, maybe if I put that in Google really quick, it'll pop up.
You know what I'll do is I'll hit you with another question, and then I'll Google search it and see what I can come up with, and we'll look very seamless. And if I just kind of disappear for a while, Pops, maybe you can do a quick song and dance or something, take over. But there is an example that I want to give, but you mentioned already a few examples, some popular examples of things that our audience might be familiar with. Are there any like popular novels or other movies that you can think of that our audience would be familiar with that can really exemplify this?
Oh yes. Well, even though Marquez's work is in the magical realism community, it's kind of the most well-known, it's actually probably not what most people will recognize as something they're familiar with. So some more popular things would be, fiction-wise, Alice Hoffman, who wrote Practical Magic and The Red Garden, did a lot of magical realism stuff. She's another big name in the genre. Sarah Addison Allen, who wrote The Sugar Queen, Garden Spells, and The Girl Who Chased the Moon. Isabel Allende is a Chilean author who is another very large name in magical realism. She wrote The House of Spirits, which is also a movie, has Meryl Streep in it. The Night Circus, right now, that by Erin Morgenstern, is #1 in the magical realism category on Amazon. Pretty Monsters by Kelly Link, a very, very interesting author. And I would include Frances Hodgson Burnett and Emily Bronte, who Frances Hodgson Burnett wrote The Secret Garden and A Little Princess, and Emily Bronte wrote Wuthering Heights. But I think that could be a debate as to whether or not they're magical realism or not. Those are some books that I thought of that have good magical realism examples. Films: Lady in the Water by M. Night Shyamalan, Immortality, which I already mentioned, Chocolat, The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, Moulin Rouge, Emile, The Green Mile, personal favorite, and Groundhog Day and Big are some other examples. And really, I mean, if you could find a lot more. These are some of my favorite movies and authors and some other things I found via Google search, but there's a lot more out there.
Yeah, you mentioned some in there that I was familiar with. That I haven't read a ton of it, but it's one of those things where when I read it, I know it, I can feel it, and I really enjoy it. I was able to find the name of the piece. It's by Italo Calvino, The Distance of the Moon. The Distance of the Moon. And it's kind of, the idea is that the story takes place shortly after the moon was actually formed. And that's why it was much closer, and so you could actually just jump up to the moon, and somebody did, and that was kind of the thing.
Ooh, that sounds awesome.
It's great. I just did a search for Radiolab Moon Story, and it popped right up, and you can listen to Liev Scrivener read it. Liev Scrivener? Yeah, Liev Scrivener. Okay, so
I'm terrible with pronunciation, so don't ask me.
Wolverine's brother.
Oh, are they related?
No, in one of the X-Men movies, he played Wolverine's brother.
Oh.
Sabretooth, right?
They get into the big fight and stuff like that. He had the great line when Wolverine shows his new metal claws, whatever you want to call those things that come out of his hand. Liev Schreiber goes, "Ooh, shiny." And it's just one of the most memorable lines in the movie. Like, I'm really so unimpressed. Like, well, this was one bad guy. But yeah.
But in all fairness, that was Wolverine Origins, and we just don't talk about that movie often. So
I just recognize the name. You know, I watched a little video by Solomon Rushdie, who writes in this area, and he was talking about it's on Big Think. You can look it up there. It's a short video of about 3 minutes or so, and he was talking about how fiction writers deal with truth, and many deal with realistic truth, but in this kind of magical realism and stuff, it's not the truth that you see, but it's the truth that you feel, what's inside us as humans, and so on. With that, and he got very happy because this would have been in 2009, I think. He'd finally been able to do a book with flying carpets. He had never been able to work one in. And the idea with that, and I think what he was bringing up in it, and you can correct me if I'm wrong about this, Stephanie, but the idea was that in magical realism, what we take as reality is fine, but there's also some magical reality, and no one in the story sees any difference between them. It's normal. For us, it would be kind of weird. So in the story that I was reviewing for this publisher, there's a blind girl in an orphanage in China, but she sees dragons in the trees that are helping her. And you know, she's blind, but she's seeing this. And so all these really magical things happen around her. with that, and it's just normal for her. So I imagine if we stick with the flying carpet thing, we could say that you begin a story, you're walking down the street, and then you see this horrible accident between two flying carpets. And the big discussion on the street isn't that carpets can fly, but that this one carpet flyer was a really bad flyer. And everything else is just normal, you see. So there's no shock, there's no disbelief that these magical things go on in the story. I got that right?
Yes, that's a great way to put it, and that's kind of the way that I think about it a lot. Is that it's these magical things that are going on, and nobody acknowledges that it's magical. Nobody acknowledges that it's out of the ordinary. It's just the way it is in this reality. But even though these things are happening, it's not the same as fantasy, where it's kind of the same. You could say the same. Well, nobody acknowledges the magic in Harry Potter because it's just that's the world Harry Potter lives in. But Harry Potter isn't as grounded in our reality as the Green Mile or Lady in the Water, for example. So
yeah, the Green Mile and Lady in the Water are good examples. The Green Mile, I thought, was a really quality example of that. I think Stephen King often will have some supernatural kind of magical realism moments, not in all of his stuff, but in a lot of his stuff. Pops, to go back to that flying carpet story, what I want to see after that accident is people exchanging insurance information, and people complaining that their rates are going to go up, because that kind of grounds it, pardon the pun, grounds it a little bit more in the realism aspect, and so we buy into it just a little bit more. I'm thinking specifically of Harrison Bergeron here, the great short story written by Kurt Vonnegut Jr., one of my favorite writers. And in it, it's a sci-fi. So he wrote it in '61, and he wrote it about the year 2081 when everybody was finally equal. And of course, he's a social satirist, so he's hyperbolizing what equality looks like, and the idea that since you can't make dumb people smarter, you have to make smart people dumber, and you can't make ugly people pretty, so you have to make pretty people ugly. So everybody wears these handicaps that are designed to make them equal. The smart people have to wear little transmitters in their ears so that just play obnoxious noises every 20 seconds so they can't keep a consistent thought, so they won't be smarter than anybody. The really beautiful people like myself would have to wear really terribly ugly masks, those types of things. Anyhow, in it, there's a character named Harrison Bergeron who rejects the status quo, decides he's going to be the emperor, and he's bigger, and he's stronger, and he's smarter, and he's faster than everybody else. And he throws off all his handicaps in the middle of a TV studio, and he begins to dance with this ballerina, makes her take off all her handicaps. So they're dancing beautifully for the first time, and this is the first time anyone in this world has seen true beauty. And by the power of their love and sheer will alone, as they dance, they begin to ascend up toward the ceiling. And they're up in the ceiling, hovering there. I love the term that Vonnegut uses, which is they neutraled gravity. Not neutralized, but just neutraled gravity. And I thought that was such a clever description. And so that's the image that I'm left with in that story shortly before somebody comes in and shoots them out of the air. It's that image of them dancing in air that I'm left with, that is really that sticks with me, even though the rest of the story plays it pretty close to the vest as a typical kind of a sci-fi type story. Is that would you qualify that as magical realism?
That's definitely a magical realism element or technique within that specific book. What was that book called again?
It's a short story by Kurt Vonnegut Jr. called Harrison Bergeron.
I will have to check that out. That sounds very interesting. But yeah, so the thing about magical realism is that it can be used as a technique, as an element, and it can just, lightly graze a story. And when that happens, it, like in this specific example, it wouldn't be something that you'd be like, okay, that book is magical realism. You wouldn't say that that's the genre. You would call it sci-fi, or that short story, rather. So there's you can use magical realism as an element to sort of create a mood, a tone, or an extreme moment, a moment of climax in a movie or film or short story or novel. And it could only just be one sort of moment or one moment here and there, and it won't make it that genre. But if it's peppering the whole story with magical elements, or if it's a magical element that is so large that it affects the plot or the characters in a significant way, then it might start to go into the realm of being a magical realism book. That makes
Absolutely.
sense.
Yeah. Welcome back, Pops.
Yeah, I thought it was you guys, but turned out to be me, and so I switched over to wireless. And for some reason, wireless shouldn't be better than the hardwire in, but nonetheless, that's how I got back on. So that's the name of that tune.
You magically realized that the Wi-Fi is going to be better than the hardwire. So,
Yeah. It was a
all right.
flying carpet. Ran into, I don't know.
Knock the line out of your computer.
Uh,
Flying
yeah,
carpet.
so everything kind of went dark there for a bit.
Yeah. So we've talked a little bit about magical realism and adding elements. I guess my question would be, when would we want to use this? What would be the best time? What can it do for our fiction? Is this something that we should shy away from? Are there any like risks to using it?
I'm not sure if there are risks exactly. I think the only risk that there might be is if your readers are not prepared, or if the author doesn't present it in a way that the reader can accept. If you have like an entire novel, 300 something pages, without any hint of magical realism aspects or any kind of tone or mood or anything that would foreshadow or suggest that this would happen, and then you just throw it in there randomly, it might not work. But then again, I mean, in this story that you just described, it sounds like the magical realism element was used in one moment, and it worked. And the reason it sounds like it worked is because it was used in a moment that was a climatic moment, where the author was really trying to create an impact, really trying to say something to the reader. And I'm sure that the author's tone and the atmosphere of the work blended and worked well with this use of this technique. So I think the risk only comes in when when it doesn't work. And that's one of those things with fiction that sometimes we have to deal with. Sometimes things work and sometimes they don't. And sometimes we have to play around with them to make them work. As far as what can it do for our fiction, it can create that climatic moment, as it did in the story that you were reading about. It can be used to create a type of mood or atmosphere. A lot of magical realism stories, the magical realism doesn't really play a large role in the plot or the characterization. It's more something that affects the mood and the tone of the book or the film or the story. And it can be used to take symbolism and metaphor one step further, which is kind of what it sounds like was happening in that climatic moment. Like, that was a moment where a lot of authors would use metaphor to say, their love seemed to create, make them float. But in this case, it really happened. And that's another example of that happening is that movie Magnolia with Tom Cruise. The whole movie is straight. Nothing magical, nothing weird, and then in this climatic moment, something really random and magical happens. I'm not going to say what it is in case anybody wants to go out there and watch it, but it worked because of the tone that the directors and the filmmakers were going with. The other thing that it can do that a lot of people are making use of right now is it can take an idea, a theme, or even a cliche from a type of story, specifically usually in speculative fiction, so something from fantasy or sci-fi or horror. It can take an element from those things and make it new, make it fresh. So, for example, right now there's an author who just came out with a book called The Theory of Invisibility. And it's a magical realism book where a woman is haunted by the death of her husband and son and unable to interact with the world, so she slowly slips into invisibility. Invisibility itself is not new. Some would even say it's tired, it's been used, but by using magical realism, she's taking a fresh approach to that idea. So that's something that magical realism can do if you're going to try to take something to the next level.
You know, it sounds a little bit like with that example that you take something like invisibility and a feeling that this character has that is like being invisible. Is it that commercial? What is it that Sally thought she was invisible and she goes around just like stealing ice cream and everything, and then she's like feeling some guy's arm and he's like, "What are you doing?" And she's like, "You can see me? I thought I was invisible." You know, the insurance commercial. You guys know what I'm talking about? Do
I
I sound
haven't
crazy?
seen that.
It was on the Super Bowl. But you take that feeling, and then through the use of magical realism, you make it a reality. And for me, kind of as a literature guy, that to me sounds like a way to really reinforce the themes that you're working toward. Like you say, especially at that climactic moment when Harrison Bergeron is raising up to the ceiling by the power of his will and love alone, and so you get this idea that those are the ideas that he's really trying to hammer home here. These are the things that are missing in this society, and this is what they can do for society. But you just get that brief moment. So for me, magical realism really adds kind of a thematic element to it as well.
Oh yes, definitely. It brings, a lot of authors can use magical realism to bring emotions, messages, symbolism, metaphor, all of those things to life, to reality. It becomes reality, and it becomes so much stronger when you do that. Personally, in my fiction, I use it oftentimes for atmosphere and for mood and tone and symbolism. And in my fiction, my magical realism elements don't usually have a major impact on the plot itself. But then there's other magical realism storylines that it's just that one thing that happens. Like in The Green Mile, there's not magical realism peppering the whole story. It's this one element of a prisoner who seems to be able to do miracles. It's just that one thing. And because it's just one thing, it affects the story in a larger way. But then there's stories like Practical Magic, where there's little bits of magic happening throughout. And it's giving a tone and atmosphere of a magical world that's a real world, but it's not affecting the plot in a major way. So there's sort of two ways that I've noticed that magical realism seems to affect a story in that sense.
Yeah. So what are is there some sort of guideline about when it would be okay to use magical realism and when you should shy away from it? I'm just thinking, are some people kind of turned off by magical realism? Can it ruin a book by chance?
I only think that it would ruin a book if it was presented in a way that just didn't work, or if it was in a genre that really, where it would be inappropriate, it wouldn't make sense. The thing about magical realism as a genre is that there is no type of story that is only magical realism. Magical realism can be something that is incorporated to any story, any time period. You know, it could be romance, it could be a detective novel, it could be an adventure book. It's always going to be cross-genre. It's never going to be just romances or just detective novels. So I don't know if there's actually a genre that would say, you know, you can't incorporate it. But then again, at the same time, if it is a genre where there are very hard and set rules, for example, you know, detective novels usually have a pretty hard and fast kind of rules that they stick to. If magical realism appears there, it might seem very out of place. It might be not something that a reader would accept unless they are prepared ahead of time. If there's some sort of a warning through foreshadowing, through the description of the book, through however means necessary, the reader will then be willing to accept that what they're reading is what this is going to happen. So if it was a detective novel, the magical realist aspect might be incorporated into the back copy of the book. And if the reader wasn't willing to read something with a kind of magical element, they just wanted the hard and fast, normal detective novel, then they wouldn't go for that book. And it might be risky in that sense. I mean, if you're in a genre like that where people want something very specific, that might be a situation where it wouldn't work, where it could be risky in that sense.
Okay, so Pops, let me throw it over to you because you've written some mystery novels, you've written some military suspense, some military thrillers, and many of your novels have supernatural influences as well. I'm thinking specifically of A Ship Possessed. I'm thinking of Vanish, the J.D. Stanton mysteries. All have some supernatural elements going on. You also have CSI Jerusalem, which is kind of like the police procedural, but kind of with that supernatural twist there. Would you qualify those, Pops, as magical realism, A, and B, did you really think much about it when you were writing that? Did you try and figure out the balance between how much should be supernatural and how much should be natural? Were you ever concerned that you were too heavy on one side or the other? What was your thought process when writing those novels?
Uh, no, I wouldn't consider magical realism at all. For the longest time, even though I did some straight mysteries, most of my novel work was in supernatural suspense. So there's always going to be some supernatural element to it. You know, there's all kinds of suspense, there's romantic suspense and stuff. The supernatural had some supernatural element in it, but that was always considered abnormal. If there were any kind of supernatural event, like in A Ship Possessed, where a submarine comes back without its crew 40 years late, wrong ocean, but it did not come back alone. That it did not come back alone part is the supernatural suspense. So what is that thing? And of course, it's out of the ordinary. This doesn't happen every day. And the magical realism, as I understand it, this wouldn't be the first submarine to come back that way. Ships would do that all the time or something, that their crews would disappear and they'd come back and, well, you know, that's just part of the way the world works. So in mine, the supernatural aspect was always outside normal experience. It wasn't the blending of the two worlds. And I was going to say this earlier before I was exiled to internet purgatory. One way to look at it is in magical realism, you take fantasy and you bring it into our normal world. In fantasy, you take the reader out of this world and put him in a different world. In science fiction, you advance and alter this world for experience. So you change time, you change worlds, planets, I mean, that sort of thing. So I didn't think any of mine would, in the supernatural suspense side, would qualify as any kind of magical realism at all.
That's a good point, and I think, Stephanie, you'd mentioned it earlier about we even with the flying carpets, we talked about it making it not out of the ordinary. Something that is out of the ordinary for our readers is not out of the ordinary for the people within the story. So yeah, so I guess that is a very good distinction between the two. Do you think that is there a proper balance, though, Stephanie, between the magical elements and the realistic moments, or is that does the balance shift and then change the genre, or how does that work? Is there some sort of formula to follow?
There is a balance, and a lot of times it seems like things that would be considered magical realisms, people could debate whether or not it is. A lot of times they seem almost like they're on the line of being between magical realism and fantasy. Is there a formula? That's one of those things that different authors can probably try to give up different formulas that might work for some people, might work for others. We all have formulas for ourselves. My personal formula when I'm trying to write magical realism is to avoid explanations. You want to explain, why is this happening? Why is there magic in the world? Avoid that. Don't explain anything, which is kind of freeing once you accept it. It's like, oh, I just have a flying carpet go through here, and I don't even have to explain why that's going on. And avoid having your characters react to it. Somebody's seeing dragons, and it's just, well, okay, another Saturday. And but it's kind of important that I want to say, so there's not confusion, that there seems to be these two different types, because you have the one type of magical realism where people don't acknowledge things as being abnormal and where there's no explanations. But then you have this other type where, and it's usually just one major event or incident of magic that's invading the real world. And in those situations, in those books, films, people do react. People do say, why is this happening? And Green Mile is an example of that. The characters are like, what's going on? You know, this weird thing happened. He cured me. And they do come up with theories about why it happened. Is he a gift from God? But because it's a magical thing that's so rooted in reality, it's almost as, what would it be like if this really happened? In more of a fantastical book, the whole book might be about, you know, how do they get this person out of jail? How do they rescue them? How does he go about curing disease all over the world? You know, it might be more fantastical. But in reality, if somebody stumbled across a miracle in the middle of death row, it's very unlikely that they would be able to save them. And that's sort of that type of magical realism. They do acknowledge it, they do ask why, but it's so rooted in reality that it almost doesn't seem magical.
Okay, yeah, and I think that's kind of where I was going with your books, Pops, is that your books are very much rooted in reality, even though they have those supernatural elements. So I don't know. I think that's still kind of a fine line to walk, though, on what would be considered magical realism and what wouldn't. 11/22/63, is it 11/22/63, where he travels back in time through the restaurant pantry, is another Stephen King novel, which very obviously magical, but the rest of the world is very very rooted in reality, and there's only a few breaks in it where people acknowledge the strangeness of it. But yeah, I guess that's what I'm trying to wrestle with is it only magical realism if we ignore the fact that it's magical, or rather our characters ignore the fact that it's magical, or can it still be magical realism where, like you say, the Green Mile, here's some miracles, but let's just play what if. Let's say this one small magical thing actually happened. How does the world react to that? Because I think, Pops, some of your books, I'm thinking of Dark Moon, that was kind of the premise. What would happen if the moon turned red? What would be the impact on the people on Earth? Again, Pops, would you call that magical realism, or are you still kind of in the camp that that's not magical realism?
No, I still wouldn't call it that, because the real world is very surprised by what happens, and there's no magic involved. Actually, in that story, we don't know why that red spot appears and grows, and I caught some flack for that. People wanted to know what it was, and I said, well, how can I write a close personal point of view? How can my characters find out unless they go to the moon? There was just no way to find out. So, no, I still wouldn't put it with that. I think the magical realism would be, well, you gave a good example with Stephen King's 11/22/63, because his time travel, his character travels back in time to save JFK from assassination, but he's got to go through all these other things, but there's no science involved. Like you said, it's a pantry. He walks into a pantry, has no idea how it works, as opposed to, say, excuse me, H.G. Wells' The Time Machine. A man creates a device. So you see, that's science fiction. You might be able to say that the King book is, at least to a degree, magical realism, but it isn't a major part. He just doesn't bother to explain how that thing works. It just does. And so in that sense, it has a magical quality. So, go ahead.
I think that because I know exactly what you're kind of talking about, Aaron, because I agree that I'm looking at these different examples and thinking that's really on the border, that kind of makes me confused about the definition. And I think what's happening is that originally, the original magical realism that was named by Alejo Carpentier, forgive me again if I missaid that, back in the 1940s, I think that magical realism is the type that we're talking about where it's not acknowledged, it's just a part of reality. Nobody sees it as odd or weird. But over time, in just the time of writing, the evolution of writing and genres mixing and blending, I think that there's sort of this new branch of magical realism, and that's what this stuff is with like The Green Mile and Big and Groundhog Day. They're not like if you were to watch those movies or read books like that, you wouldn't necessarily think of Marquez's work, which is, you know, The 100 Years of Solitude. Marquez's work has a very distinct quality to it of this sense of magical realism that is just, it's just reality. It's just what it is. Whereas The Green Mile, Big, has a magical element that is so rooted in reality that we almost forget that it's not real. I think that's the evolution of the genre, of the techniques, blending of the techniques. I think it might be a lot of blending fantasy, supernatural with magical realism. And so that's why it's kind of different. But it still fits that original definition of blending reality and magic. And that's why it still fits within the genre, but it is on the border. Very much so. And, you know, experts, you know, people with PhDs might listen to this podcast and be like, whoa, whoa, whoa. We have something to say about that. So it's hard to say for sure.
I like that. I like what you say. It's the kind of the evolution of the genre or the natural change. The genres do grow and expand and contract, and I think a lot of writers really pride themselves on finding the crossroads between them, being able to mix them. Star Wars is very much an old fantasy in a sci-fi setting, and so you get kind of the hybrid of both of those, and I think since its inception in the 40s, the magical realism has gone through its own kind of transformation, and I think that's positive for it. I think that we're more willing as readers to go along with it.
I think we need to distinguish between a book having an element of something and being part of a genre. So, for example, the Stephen King book that we've been talking about, I would not say his book is magical realism, but I would say that it has a magical aspect to it. He leaves it up to the reader to decide if it's science, magic, whatever it might be, but it plays such a small part in the overall story, so it's really just an element of it. So I wouldn't classify it as magical realism in any way. And so it's not unusual to do that. That's why we get these hyphenated genres. Romantic comedy. Well, is it a comedy or is it a romance? Well, it's both. They have elements of each. Or you could have an action-adventure story that has a mystery involved in it. And so it's not truly a mystery, but it has a mystery element. And that's one of the ingredients in the recipe for that particular book.
I feel like in a lot of ways the mixing of those genres, I can take the mystery and the action adventure story and mix those together, or the romance and the comedy, I can mix those together, and nobody's going to bat an eyelash. But if I take a romantic comedy and throw in a magical element, I think you have more of a potential for an audience crying foul, for raising a flag and saying, hey, hang on, that can't actually happen. But I guess that's true for anything, because you can, if you don't do it well. And so the question then becomes, at least for me, Stephanie, I would ask you, how do you do magical realism well? If you're going to have an element in your book that seems fantastical, it seems magical, it goes against what we know to be true, but you want to weave it in because you feel like it's at the proper moment, the moment of climax, and it's really going to reinforce your themes and your ideas, and it's this beautiful image that is going to transcend everything that you've worked on. Do you have any recommendations for our listeners of how they can approach that particular thing without perhaps crossing any lines or causing the readers to fall out of the story?
Yeah, it's funny that you asked that, because that's kind of what I'm trying to do right now with my next novel, the one I'm working on. Is that it doesn't have magical realism sprinkled throughout, but there is going to be, you know, an aspect of it in the climax, and so I want to make sure that at that point it makes sense. It doesn't feel like, wait, what just happened? You know, you don't want your reader to feel cheated. And so what I've done is I have strategically interwoven magical realism, little tiny things throughout the story that aren't 100% clear to the reader whether or not they are magical realism or just metaphor. That's kind of what I do with a lot of my work. A White Room too, I sort of play around with using magical realism techniques when they're not really clear if it's magical realism or not to the reader until maybe the end. And by doing that, the reader doesn't really feel amiss. The reader doesn't feel confused when it happens because you've had all these little foreshadowing tidbits along the way. And suddenly it all makes sense. Suddenly it all clicks. It was all leading up to this the whole time. I have to think back to Magnolia with Tom Cruise, though, because in that movie there was no suggestion of magical realism at all until the very end, until this really random climatic moment. Nothing else was happening that was magical at all, but it worked. And the reason it worked, I would say, is two things. One was the tone of the story itself. The tone of the story was very strange. Like you felt like something was off, something was strange, something was going to happen, but it really wasn't clear what it was. I mean, really, the story is following people going through what must seem like just regular life activities. And it's following multiple people, a lot of different characters. And at the climatic moment, all of their climatic moments happen at once. And it almost seems as if this bizarre thing that happens is a result of all of them coming to that climatic moment at the same time. And something about the way that it happens, it's surprising to the viewer. The viewer is like, what? What's happening? But it doesn't cheat the story either. It didn't solve any of their problems for them. It didn't fix anything without any hard work for them. They all still had to deal with their problems after this big thing happened. But the big thing itself sort of gave them all perspective. It sort of gave them a viewpoint in a sense. And even though the viewer was surprised, everybody else in the movie just kind of went along with it. And so the viewer sort of just ended up doing the same thing, like, oh, okay, well, I guess that happened. and it worked. And I think that it's really something that if you want to write magical realism, if you want to use it in your work, you have to study it. You have to read other books, watch films with it, really get a grasp for the feel of it, because it really does have a feel. There's some sort of feel to the tone, to the atmosphere, that it's really difficult to describe. When you describe certain supernatural books, I can tell just by listening to them that they're not magical realism. And it's just because of a feel, and it's really hard to say exactly what that feel is. So I think that's tone and mood, and it's that kind of thing that's hard to put your finger on. But that's probably something that people will pick up if they study it.
For me, I think the most important thing you said is that it didn't cheat the story. It didn't solve all of the problems. I think that's one thing that we really want to stress, at least for me, I want to stress to the readers, is don't use magical realism to solve the problems, because then what you have is Deus Ex Machina. When there's an unexplained resolution to the problem that the characters are not directly involved in, now it's just kind of that unsatisfying ending. Whereas if it's an element of it, not the solution, but a part of the solution perhaps, that just, or it happens kind of at the same time, then it can really kind of add something to the feel. But I think the big thing to avoid is to avoid the Deus Ex Machina with that, and that can be tough to balance. But I think of Harrison Bergeron again. The dancing was not the solving of the problem at all. That came after Harrison Bergeron decided to throw off all of his handicaps and convince the ballerina to throw off all of her handicaps. So they made their own magical realism. They solved their own problems, if we can look at it in that way. So well said.
It was the result. It was the result of solving the problems.
Yeah.
Another thing that writers can think about if they're trying to put magical realism in the book is that it shouldn't be something that's just random, that's just there, that to just do it to do it. It should have meaning. It should have purpose. That whenever you're putting magical realism into a book, it's almost like bringing symbolism to life in a way. And for example, the dancing is a symbolism of what they accomplished, and so the symbolism itself can't resolve problems. it's a symbol, and so if the writer asks themselves why do they want to put this element in, what does it mean, what does it stand for, where did it come from an emotion, from an action, how did it, in a sense, come out? Because if it's just random, if it doesn't mean anything, if it's just there to be there, it's not going to have the same effects.
Agreed. Well said. I like that. Don't put it in there just for the sake of having it in there. That's another good thing to remember, for sure. So
Yes.
we are quickly running out of time. Any last-minute questions, comments, or concerns, Pops?
No, again, I would just distinguish between magical realism as a genre and that as an element in a story. And to answer one of the questions you asked a little bit earlier, I think you shy away from it if it breaks the fictive dream. Fictive dream is everything in story, and anything that knocks the reader out of the story, and it doesn't matter if it's magical realism or whatever, is damaging to the story. And readers won't hang around and they'll feel cheated. So you have to be careful whatever elements you put in there, such as supernatural suspense. You have the supernatural invading our world, and magical realism is part of the world. Make sure that it fits for the genre, and that it furthers the story. It isn't just a fun exercise in writing.
Absolutely. Well said.
Definitely.
Yeah. Any other last-minute thoughts, Stephanie?
No, I don't think so. Although I could tell you that I feel like we only kind of grazed the topic in a way. There is so much to magical realism that people can find out about and learn, and it's a great, really, really amazing genre of fiction, and I hope some people who are just now hearing about it go out there and pick up a magical realism book and check it out.
Well, let's say that they do want to do that, and they're a little bit lost as to where to start, so they would like to contact you. How might our viewers be able to get in touch with you to talk a little bit more about magical realism and kind of pick your brain?
People can find me on my website, stephaniecarroll.net, and they can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Goodreads, basically every social media you can find. I'm always under Carroll Books, and that's Carroll with 2 R's and 2 L's. And so that's a great way for them to find me. And if they're interested, I'm pretty sure I'm going to try to put up an article about magical realism on my website here soon, or I'm going to put it in my newsletter, which can be signed up for at my website.
Yeah, if you do, please let me know, and I'll let my followers know. I'll put it on my social media outlets as well.
Great.
But yeah, thank you for that. And of course, they can always order your book, A White Room, which was inspired by The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. In part, is that correct?
That is correct.
Excellent. So if you've read The Yellow Wallpaper and you enjoyed it, you're going to like her book as well, A White Room. Very well done. You can find it on Amazon. You can find it on her website as well. So, Pops, how can people get in touch with you?
Well, they see the altongansky.com. Oh, I guess I have the Blue Ridge Mountain Christian Writers Conference down there, BRMCWC. That's where I do most of my blogging, and it'll get a little more active, but that's where our writers blog from time to time. But forget that, and forget about me, Aaron. What happened to you last week? Something on a particular day happened?
Are we talking about the book launch of Hand of Adonai? Is that what we're
talking about? Your new book?
Yes, we were. So that's available. You can find it on Amazon.com. You can always reach me on aarongansky.com. But yeah, it's got 6 reviews. Last I checked, I haven't checked in the last couple of days. 6 reviews on Amazon. Some good positive reviews. We had a good time. A lot of fun. We did some good trivia and stuff like that. And I did an interesting thing where I asked some of my fans. I like calling them fans. Some of my friends and family, and both of my fans changed their profile pictures on their website or on their Facebook to a picture of the cover of the Hand of Adonai series. And so that was awesome. Really cool, yeah, to see all the comments of everyone saying, "Oh, I'll do it," and they all had the same picture right there, and it was really, I became very verklempt. I almost cried. I was a little choked up with their outpouring of support. I did bribe them with putting their name in a drawing for a $25 gift card, Amazon gift card. So, which I said I was going to do on Monday. It is now Tuesday. I am a terrible person. So, if you're listening, I will do that tonight, and I will let everybody know. Thank you to Alicia Morales, who we had on a couple weeks ago, who just kindly reminded me tonight of like, did you ever do that? I need to do that, so I'll do that tonight. But yeah, so you can find that on Amazon.com, and if you have read it, if you'd be kind enough to leave a review on Amazon or Goodreads, I'd really appreciate it. So I think that's what we have for this week. So thank you all for listening, and until next week, good writing.